On the 12th of September in the year 2025, the land of Burkina Faso stood witness to a moment that history will not easily forget. In a single day, 764 colossal machines roared into existence. Bulldozers, graders, cranes, trucks, all not as tools of dependence but as instruments of sovereignty. This was not charity from abroad. This was not another loan buried under interest. This was the vision of one man, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, turned into the labor of a nation. For generations, Africa has been told to wait, to borrow, to beg. Yet here stands a different message, that a people, when united, can raise their own roads, carve their own future, and defend their own soil. But this event is larger than the machines themselves. It is about a revolution of spirit, where the masses are no longer bystanders but builders of destiny. Do not blink. History is unfolding before our very eyes. Stay with us, subscribe, and let your voice stand tall for a future where Africa shapes its own destiny. The story begins not with the machines themselves, but with a promise. When Captain Ibrahim Traoré rose to leadership, he spoke of a new kind of revolution, one that would not merely exist in speeches, but in the soil, in the roads, and in the hands of ordinary people. Too many times had Africa been promised development, only to see it tied to the strings of outside powers. Too many times had bulldozers arrived, only to be abandoned, rusting in fields because they were not truly ours. This time the stage was different. The voice behind the vision was firm, and the people of Burkina Faso listened. On the 12th day of September 2025, that vision began to take physical shape. In the heart of Ouagadougou, a fleet of machines stood lined like soldiers in formation. 764 in total: bulldozers, road graders, cranes, mobile projectors, trucks of every type, tippers, tankers, and concrete mixers, each gleaming in the sun as if to declare a new dawn. The atmosphere was charged, not with spectacle alone, but with meaning. These were not tools of foreign contractors. They were instruments for a homegrown revolution. Traore, the young captain turned head of state, made clear that this equipment was not meant for show. It was destined for work, immediate, relentless, and deeply strategic. The brigades routières, construction brigades envisioned under his leadership, were now armed with the means to break through centuries of neglect. 4 regions were marked for this new beginning: Yad, Kouis, Gulmu, and Bankui. Each would host its own brigade, disciplined not as mercenaries of concrete, but as soldiers of development. Already, training was underway in Bonongo, where young men and women prepared to take up tools, not guns, to defend their homeland through infrastructure. The symbolism was powerful. For decades, roads had been seen as the responsibility of the state alone, and often the state outsourced that duty to companies beyond the continent. Too often, when times grew difficult, citizens saw no reason to protect what had been built. Roads cracked, bridges fell, and anger spilled into the streets. Tires were burned, pavements torn apart. But Traore spoke a different language. He said the revolution of infrastructure could not last if it was only designed and built by governments. It must be owned by the people. For the first time, the brigades were not just construction units. They were symbols of popular participation, a call to the masses to see themselves as custodians of their nation's lifelines. This is why the event of September was more than a handover. It was the second chapter in a 5-part journey. Earlier, Traore had declared that what had arrived was but a fifth of the planned equipment. And true to his word, the second fifth now stood before the people, confirming him as a leader who matched words with deeds. Each machine, each piece of steel was a testimony to continuity, to faith honored, to promises fulfilled. The brigades themselves were not abstract ideas. They had names, locations, and clear missions. In Guirico, 2 brigades were already in motion. In the central region, another 2 were working. Now, with the reinforcement of 4 more brigades, the nation counted at least 8 in total, each committed to the task of carving paths through both city and countryside. Their mission was clear: to decongest, to open, to connect, and ultimately to liberate. Desenclavement, The breaking of isolation became the word on every tongue. Cities and villages that had long remained cut off from trade, from medical care, from each other, would soon breathe the air of connection. Yet what made the moment even more electric was the dual purpose of these roads. They were not merely for commerce and comfort. They were lifelines for the military, arteries through which supplies, reinforcements, and strategies could flow. In a land battling insecurity, the road itself became a weapon. Smooth passage meant stronger defense, better protection, and a safer people. Thus, the machinery was not only about asphalt and gravel, it was about sovereignty, resilience, and survival. The crowd that witnessed this handover understood they were part of something more profound. Engineers, technicians, regional directors all stood not as bureaucrats but as witnesses of a shift in national identity. They were being asked not only to build but to inspire, to explain to their communities why these roads mattered, why they must be protected, why they must be maintained. This was no longer a top-down project. It was the weaving of a collective will. But as the engines rumbled to life, and as 4 brigades prepared to move into action, one question lingered in the air like a drumbeat waiting for its answer. Was this truly the dawn of a people-led revolution, or merely the beginning of another cycle destined to face resistance? The true climax of the story was not the machines parked in rows, nor the cameras capturing their metallic shine. It was the message that came with them. A message that cut deep into the marrow of Burkina Faso's history. No revolution can survive without the people. Ibrahim Traoré spoke not as a distant head of state, but as a comrade, reminding his listeners that even the best-planned infrastructure would crumble if it was not rooted in the care of the masses. He invoked a memory that many elders in Africa know too well. How often had governments unveiled shiny projects, ribbon cuttings with speeches, only for the same roads to fall into ruin within a few years? How often had bridges been celebrated only to collapse because no one maintained them? In the past, the state built while the people remained spectators. When frustration came, they burned tires, destroyed pavements, and left symbols of progress in ashes. But now a new call echoed. The people must be involved not just in usage, but in conception, construction, and protection. This call resonated like a drumbeat of dignity. To be a participant was different from being a mere beneficiary. It was the shift from dependency to ownership. It was the spirit of anti-colonial Africa breathing through the present moment. The same spirit that once drove nations to claim independence, now pushing them to defend their roads, bridges, and dignity. Traore asked his leaders, coordinators, and regional directors to go back to their people not only with machinery, but with words, with clarity, with leadership. Explain the revolution, he said. Make them see why they must take part, why they must volunteer, why they must protect what they build with their own hands. The crowd stirred with recognition. It was as if an old truth, buried under decades of disappointment, had been spoken aloud again. Development could no longer be something done for the people. It had to be done with the people. And in that moment, the brigades routières were no longer technical units. They were schools of civic education, training grounds where the nation's future was not only paved, but taught, lived, and shared. Across Ouagadougou and beyond, the news spread quickly. Radio programs described the arrival of the 764 machines as a historic milestone. Newspapers carried headlines that framed the initiative as proof of a leadership that kept its word. In markets, conversations shifted from rumors of despair to whispers of hope. Maybe this time it will last. Among the youth, especially those in Bonongo preparing for training, the sense of purpose was palpable. For once, the work ahead was not just labor, it was patriotism in action. Yet the emotional high of the moment did not erase the deeper question of who truly benefited from this revolution. On one hand, the brigades would create jobs, give dignity, and open doors to rural communities. On the other, their roads were also to serve the military, securing supply lines in a country still battling insecurity. Was this a people's project, or was it first a war project dressed in the colors of development? Could it be both? For the international observer, these questions may appear technical. But for the citizen walking dusty roads or waiting for medicines in a remote village, they were questions of survival. To them, a smooth road was not a luxury, it was life itself. It meant children reaching schools, farmers bringing goods to markets, mothers reaching clinics before it was too late. In that sense, the revolution was already a success because it gave voice to a longing that had lived in silence for too long. The peak of emotion was captured when citizens, engineers, and soldiers stood side by side, each recognizing that they were now bound together. The machines were not the climax. The unity was. Roads could be built, machines could rust, but a people awakened to their own role in nation-building. That was a force no storm could easily break. Still, under the roar of engines and applause of the crowd, a silent tension lingered. Revolutions are not secured in one day. They are tested in months, in years, in decades. Would this call to popular participation truly take root, or would old habits, apathy, vandalism, dependency return? Would the people who cheered the machines also stand to protect them when trials came? These were the questions that trailed behind the optimism, questions that made the air heavy even as hope burned bright. For a revolution of spirit is far harder to maintain than a revolution of machinery. And so, while the engines warmed, while the brigades prepared, the real battle was just beginning. Because at the heart of it all lies a single truth. Machines can build roads, but only the people can keep a revolution alive. In the immediate days after the handover of the 764 machines, the landscape of Burkina Faso did not yet look different. Roads remained unpaved, bridges still carried scars of time, and villages remained distant from one another. Yet something had already changed: expectation. In the cafes, in the fields, in the schools, people began to speak of a future in which the land would be connected, the burden of isolation lifted. For the first time in years, hope moved faster than despair. The short-term effects were visible in the recruitment drives. In Banongo, hundreds of young men and women stepped forward to join the brigades. They came not only for wages, though wages mattered, but for dignity. The dignity of saying, "I built this road with my own hands." For too long, work had meant dependence on contracts given by foreign firms. Now, work meant service to one's own soil. The brigades became training grounds, where youth learned not only how to handle bulldozers and graders, but how to see themselves as guardians of the Republic's lifelines. In the medium term, the impact reached beyond employment. The revolution of infrastructure carried with it a revolution of mentality. Where once roads were seen as property of the state to be ignored or vandalized, now they were seen as collective possessions to be protected. Communities began to organize local watch groups, volunteers offering time to help maintain pathways, elders teaching younger generations the value of safeguarding what was built. It was not yet a perfect system, but it was a start, an awakening of responsibility. Politically, the initiative carried immense weight. In Africa, legitimacy is often tied not to speeches, but to delivery. When citizens see concrete, when they walk on smooth tarmac, when they reach hospitals faster, they believe in leadership. Ibrahim Traoré, through this initiative, strengthened not only the nation's roads, but his own standing as a leader who keeps promises. Critics who once dismissed him as too young, too inexperienced, were forced to reckon with results. Promises turned into machines, words turned into brigades, vision turned into labor. In politics, this was no small victory. Yet, as with all revolutions, challenges remained. Would funding sustain the brigades? Would corruption creep into procurement and maintenance? Would local elites seek to capture the benefits for themselves? These questions hung in the air, reminding everyone that the battle was not only against distance and dust, but against the old habits that had crippled Africa's progress for generations. At the same time, the initiative lit a fire across neighboring countries. If Burkina Faso could mobilize its people to build and protect its own infrastructure, why not Mali? Why not Niger? Why not Senegal? Could this be the seed of a continental awakening, where African development is not outsourced but homegrown? The ripples were already visible in the way regional newspapers framed the event. Un modèle de souveraineté en marche. For the citizens of Burkina Faso, the most profound change was not in asphalt or machinery, but in the shift from passivity to participation. It was the understanding that a revolution of infrastructure was not about the state building for the people, but about the people building with the state. It was at its core a reclamation of dignity. And so, in conversations under mango trees and in crowded markets, a new kind of pride began to emerge. Not pride borrowed from the outside, not pride based on promises yet to come, but pride born of action, of collective effort, of visible transformation. The revolution was not yet complete, but it was real, and it belonged to the people. If you believe this is the kind of awakening Africa long prayed for, declare it in the comments below. But even as voices rose in unity, another question lingered like a shadow stretching across the horizon. What would the world beyond Burkina Faso make of this revolution, and how would it respond when an independent Africa began to pave its own future without asking for permission? The world was watching. For some, the sight of 764 machines lined like an army of steel was a symbol of national pride. For others, it was a signal of shifting power. Burkina Faso, a landlocked nation long considered fragile, was declaring something that resonated far beyond its borders. That development could be claimed without dependency. The African Union welcomed the initiative cautiously, praising the vision of national brigades routières while reminding member states of the importance of regional integration. ECOWAS, strained by tensions with several Sahel governments, found itself at a crossroads. To criticize the movement would appear to undermine popular will. To endorse it would mean accepting a model outside the traditional frameworks of donor-driven development. The silence, at times louder than words, revealed the unease of an institution caught between sovereignty and external influence. Russia and China, ever keen to expand their presence on the continent, observed the developments with interest. For Moscow, which had already cultivated ties in the Sahel, the mobilization of popular brigades aligned with its narrative of anti-Western independence. Beijing, with its long-standing focus on infrastructure investment, saw in Burkina Faso both an opportunity and a challenge. An opportunity to supply technology and materials, but a challenge to its monopoly if Africans chose to rely first on their own labor. The United States and the European Union reacted differently. Western media framed the initiative with caution, describing it as ambitious but uncertain. Analysts warned of the risks of militarizing infrastructure by linking road building so closely to the armed forces. Others pointed to questions of sustainability. Could Burkina Faso maintain such a massive fleet of machines without foreign assistance? Beneath these critiques lay a deeper concern: the erosion of Western influence in a region once firmly under its shadow. To many in Washington and Brussels, the brigades routières were not just construction units. They were symbols of a continent daring to act without permission. Diplomatically, Burkina Faso's move stirred debates. Could such a model inspire other African nations to launch their own people-driven initiatives? Would it spark a wider movement towards sovereignty, not only in roads but in agriculture, education, and industry? If so, the global order, long comfortable with Africa as a recipient rather than a creator, would have to adjust. But one truth was clear. In a world of shifting alliances and rising tensions, the roads of Burkina Faso were no longer just about asphalt. They were about the future of Africa's place in the world. And yet, behind every applause and every frown from abroad, a larger question began to echo. If Africa truly takes this path, will the elders of this generation live to see a continent finally united in dignity, or will external pressures once again derail the dream? The revolution of infrastructure in Burkina Faso has lit a torch. But as every elder knows, a torch burns only as long as it is fed. The question now is whether this flame will illuminate the path to a sovereign Africa, or whether winds of doubt, corruption, and foreign interference will blow it out. There are two roads ahead. The first is the road of triumph. If the brigades routiers succeed, villages will be connected, farmers will reach markets, and soldiers will defend borders with confidence. More than that, a culture of ownership will take root. People will not only build but also preserve. The spirit of anti-colonial struggles will find new life, not in protests or petitions, but in roads, bridges, and infrastructure that stand the test of time. This road points to a future where Africa no longer waits for donors but drives its own destiny. The second road is one of peril. If machines are mismanaged, if spare parts go missing, if corruption sinks its claws into the brigades, the dream could collapse. The people's faith, once betrayed, may never be restored. Roads left unfinished would not only mark failed projects but broken promises. And history has taught us that broken promises can become wounds that take generations to heal. Between these two roads lies choice. Not the choice of one man, not even the choice of a government, but the choice of a people. Will communities stand up to protect what is theirs? Will leaders resist the temptation of personal gain? Will youth embrace the discipline needed to sustain the brigades? These are the decisions that will determine whether the FASO MBO initiative becomes a blueprint for the continent or another forgotten chapter. Beyond Burkina Faso, the stakes are continental. If one nation proves that African development can be born of its own soil, others may follow. Niger, Mali, Guinea, nations struggling with similar challenges will watch closely. A successful model could spread across the Sahel and beyond, igniting a pan-African spirit of self-reliance. But if the model fails, skeptics will point to it as proof that Africa must always lean on outsiders. The entire continent hangs in the balance. For the elders who remember the days of independence, this moment feels like déjà vu. Then, too, Africa stood at a crossroads, caught between freedom and dependency. The torch lit by those who fought colonialism has passed into new hands. The question is whether the new generation will let it burn brighter or allow it to fade into smoke. The choice is here, the choice is now. And as every road stretches into the horizon, so too does the destiny of a continent. But before we close, let us gather all these threads, hope, struggle, promise, and peril, into one final message that every son and daughter of Africa must carry forward. What unfolded in Burkina Faso on the 12th of September 2025 was not just the delivery of machines. It was the delivery of a message that roads, bridges, and infrastructure are not simply the work of governments, but the inheritance of a people. Ibrahim Traoré did not merely place keys into the hands of brigades, he placed responsibility into the hands of a nation. The revolution of infrastructure, at its heart, is a revolution of dignity. It tells Africa that sovereignty is not achieved by words alone, nor by waiting for approval from abroad. It is achieved when the people rise, when they claim ownership of their future, when they see themselves not as passive recipients but as architects of destiny. This is the very essence of anti-colonial Africa, a spirit that does not fade with time but adapts, grows, and finds new battles to fight. Today, that battle is fought not with rifles but with bulldozers, graders, and the will to maintain what is built. And yet this moment is not only about resistance, it is about creation. To build roads that link markets and villages, to carve paths that carry children to schools and mothers to hospitals, to open the arteries of trade and communication, that is the lifeblood of African development. It is not charity. It is not dependency. It is the rebirth of a continent that has too long been spoken for, now speaking in its own voice. But revolutions are fragile. Machines can rust. Promises can be broken. Dreams can be betrayed. The question is not whether Traore has given the tools. The question is whether the people will hold the line, protect the vision, and pass it forward to generations yet unborn. That is the task of a people determined never again to bow. If this story moves you, do not let it end here. Like, share, and subscribe. Our ancestors were silenced for too long. Let us speak our future out loud together. Tell us in the comments what you believe this moment means for Africa. Shout, New Africa, Africa rise. It's time for Africa. Let the world hear that the flame is still burning. For in the end, the roads being built are not only in Burkina Faso. They are roads into tomorrow, roads into dignity, roads into freedom. And their foundation is not of stone or gravel, but of people who believe.